In this lecture, we're going to talk about the style of Impressionism. So what happens is during the last part of the 1800s, France is undergoing many changes that stem from the fact that it's transitioning into a modernized industrial nation. And from this transition, there emerges a style of art that captured this climate of change, Impressionism. With industrialization, what we see is the rise of the urban center, Paris being the largest one in France, and the ruler at the time, Napoleon III, was doing a lot to modernize the city, which likely not only suited the economic needs of the time, but also was likely the very carefully calculated statement to celebrate and bring attention to his role in France's rise to industrial prominence. He tasked this person, Baron Haussmann, with overseeing the urban renewal, this project, and it included widening the streets and the avenues, opening up the river to increase commerce by removing the buildings that had lined the river Seine, which was the river that ran through the center of the city. He changed the buildings, so much of the historical buildings of Paris were taken down and replaced by these more modernized structures. And all of this was fully realized around the 1870s. With Monet's painting that we see here, we get a view of this new modern Paris. We see this painting recording an unusual vantage point, as if it's a new way to see the city. We see all these people down here that crowd the street, showing this growing urban population. The paint is applied in these tiny flicks to slightly blur the figures, as though their motion has been momentarily frozen in time. And that was what, in part, Impressionism was all about, capturing an impression, a quick frozen moment in time. We cannot see the figures' faces, and they do all seem to be rendered the same way, which you could argue suggests perhaps a lack of individuality and the anonymity and isolation that was becoming characteristic of urban life. It's this last point that I think is really important to focus on for a minute, and this is what makes Impressionism so well known. When we think about Impressionism, most people like the style because it's pretty, it's visually appealing to look at. These images definitely do coincide with our cultural conventions regarding beauty, particularly these really nice, soft pastel colors that are so typical in Impressionist paintings. But these images are not simply beautiful. That's a way too simplistic, way too superficial way to think about this style. What's really intimated here, and I think this is going to be really clear to us over the course of this lecture, is that in many ways, these seemingly pretty works are artworks that are reflections of anxiety, brought about in this time where there's all this change. And a lot of these changes are related directly to the industrialization that we're talking about when we were learning about realism, and we will continue to talk about as we're learning about Impressionism. So let's take a look at some different works of art that are evidencing some of these points that I'm making. We'll start with Gustav Klimt. I am so obsessed with Klimt. If I had my way, I would do my whole lecture on only his work. If I wasn't so obsessed with Edward Manet as well. Gosh, the struggle is definitely real, trying to take it down a notch and not just focus only on it what I want to, which is Klimt and Manet. And I love them so much because of this really compelling, deep, rich, velvety black that they use. Isn't this just so gorgeous? Oh, I love it. Okay, focus. All right, so Klimt, he's a little bit unlike many of the other Impressionists we're going to look at in this lecture because he's working with a tighter brushwork. And we're even going to see that tighter brushwork in the painting by Manet as well. If we go back for a second, you can see that this is loose and kind of feathery. Here, much more tighter, right? And this is what I'm talking about. This tighter brushwork kind of a little bit connects him more so with this stylistic precursor to Impressionism, which is realism. And we're going to talk about this further in the next slide. I think this image is a really appropriate follow-up to the Monet painting we just looked at, where again the viewer is presented with this unconventional view of a Parisian street. although this seems to be more of a deeper psychological probe and on multiple levels. I think this is truly a complex painting. First of all, we have these empty streets, which is kind of like uncomfortable, kind of unsettling. It's like too quiet, too stark. Now, if we do a bit of a formal analysis here, you've got all of these like angled walls that create these diagonal lines, which we know instills a sense of tension within the work. You have a high horizon line to trap the viewer in. We cannot escape, nor can this guy escape, nor can this lady down here escape. And the man seems trapped in behind this balustrade. What's depicted here provides us with a closer view of Baron Haussmann's redesign of the city, particularly his work in changing the character of Paris's residential districts, which is the view that we see here. Now, second of all, this painting, I think, is really probing into the psychology of the subject. This man we see from behind, he looks out onto this empty street. What's his deal? Is he like lost in thought? Is he sad? Is he lonely? Is he like being a creeper and staring at this lady? And she like totally seems like she's trapped, right? She's kind of like out here by herself. And that's what he's doing, just like staring at this lady. We are seeing a theme that does have a reoccurrence in Impressionist painting, which is the idea of voyeurism, this act of looking at others, and they're aware of that's happening. They're unaware, excuse me. The act of looking at others while they are unaware that it's happening. And we're going to talk more about this later on in the lecture. And then finally, we do need to consider us, the viewer, and our presence here. His back is to us, which also creates a sense of alienation and isolation, because we are not being acknowledged even though we're in such close proximity to this person. And here he is, my other favorite, Edouard Manet. Now, let's talk about the style of Impressionism and its stylistic precursor, which is realism. Impressionism grows directly out of realism, particularly with its focus on everyday life, the here and the now, not in the past, and this honest portrayal of everyday life, which was not done in an overly emotional way, that kind of like emotionalism that we saw with Romanticism. Like realism in this sense, Impressionism's stylistic focus really is on naturalism. But as we'll come to see, this will be more with subject matter than its articulation. The difference between realism and Impressionism, and it's a slight but important nuance of difference, is that realism seems to be more focused on everyday rural life, while Impressionism seems to be more focused on everyday urban life. Okay, so two different types of spaces. Now this image here, many scholars categorized as realists. Every fiber of my being is pushing against this. I just simply cannot do it. I am sorry. The closest I can come to this and still be able to sleep at night, to still be able to look at myself in the mirror, is to reluctantly say perhaps maybe it's a transitional image, that there are both realist and impressionist features. My big issue is this, okay, in this image, the brushwork is loosening up. It's becoming too painterly to, I think, really be appropriately considered realist. But here's what really gets me. With this supposed classification of it being a realist image, oh, hey, it's an appropriation, right? What does that even mean, okay? Yeah, it's a reflection of the here and the now, and sure. Oh, but it's actually also, if you look right here, copying a high Renaissance image originally made by Raphael. So I don't know how here and now that is when it's copying something that's coming out of the 16th century. What this means, appropriation, is taking a well-known artwork and making changes to it. Enough changes to make it a unique work of art. These certainly aren't the same, right? But it's not so unique that you can't identify the source image. I suspect that Manet may have undertaken this strategy here to maybe comment on the departure from the past that was happening as Paris was becoming increasingly industrialized or modernized. Now let's talk about the subject matter. We're seeing everyday life, but more specifically, it's leisure. This is a very common theme in Impressionism. People were making more money and they were using their extra money and spending it on leisurely activities. Picnicking was a particular popular pastime for city dwellers and a way for them to enjoy nature. And here's a little fun fact. This is the context in which the sandwich was invented. Now, this work depicts a nude woman and two clothed men, and these figures were based on living, identifiable people that Manet knew. The men are dressed in fashionable Parisian attire of the 1860s. Now, when this work came out and was displayed to the public, they were shocked and they were horrified. You might be able to think why. First of all, rather than this being like a traditional, idyllic pastoral scene, you have this audacious nude woman sitting with these two guys, and she's not ashamed. She totally looks out at the viewer, makes eye contact, unabashed, not at all embarrassed or uncomfortable with the fact that she's naked at a picnic. But the criticism wasn't limited simply to this aspect of the subject matter. It extended to the aesthetics as well. Instead of Manet painting according to standards of academic painting, which was traditional academic painting, Manet used a brushstroke that, first of all, was too loose, right, not tight and crisp. And it didn't define these forms in these crisp, classically inspired lines. There's no play of light and shadow on the forms, which has the effect of flattening them, making them, especially the nude woman, appear harsh. She's not at all idealized. Instead, she looks kind of pasty and flat. People thought this was ugly, not a pleasing work of art to look at. Now, even more scandalous to the French public was this work, which depicts a young prostitute. Olympia was a common professional name for prostitutes in the 19th century. We see that she reclines on a bed, entirely nude, except for this fabulous ribbon tied around her neck, and the fashionable slippers on her feet, flower in her hair, lovely little bracelet. Now again, we have this really brazen female. She meets the viewer's gaze directly, unembarrassed and indifferent. Behind her is a maid that's presenting her a bouquet of flowers, probably from a client. And there is actually some iconographical analysis we can conduct here. We have the maid, the flowers, and it's really hard to see in this image if there's this little kitty cat right here. And all three of these are symbols for sexuality. Flowers traditionally have been metaphorical references to female genitalia. The cat represents the animalistic urges of sexuality, particularly female sexuality. And then there is the highly problematic stereotype that African women were having this unchecked hypersexuality because they were not yet exposed to the moralizing and civilizing mindsets of proper European society. And it was this particular symbolic reference really caused quite a stir with those who saw this painting. To see a depiction of a prostitute in Impressionist painting is not super far out in left field. This is a representation of leisure. If you have extra money, want to spend it on something, you want to have a little fun, hire a prostitute. Now, even though images of prostitutes were not unheard of during this period, viewers were taken aback by the shamelessness of Olympia and her look of almost defiance. They thought that the painting had this almost kind of unfeminine roughness of the figure, and this came from both her demeanor and Manet's style of painting, which I am so in love with, and everyone back in the 1860s was hating. Again, the figure appears flat, and this flatness was emphasized by the fact that the shape and the color of her body is so well matched by the shape and the color of the bed. She looks washed out. Now, if we do a little comparison, we can see that, this looks pretty similar in composition and subject matter to Titian's High Renaissance, and actually technically it's Venetian style, Venus of Urbino. Now, if we do a comparison of the two, we can see how Manet's work does defy historical convention. Olympia's body, if you compare it to that of the Venus of Urbino, is not fleshy and curved. Hers is really rigid and almost angular. This is more traditionally what a feminine body should look like. Women have a little extra meat on their bones. They're curvy and they're soft and they're squishy. That's what women are like. Venus is looking kind of like coy, right? Head slightly tilted, but still looking at the viewer in this kind of like flirty way. And Olympia's look is much more direct, almost confrontational. This is something else that's really important. Titian's nude figure, she can hide behind her name. Her name is Venus, the mythological erotic goddess. And so traditionally she would be depicted in the nude. Oh, now it makes it okay. But Manet's figure is given the name of prostitute outright. Now it's interesting because these both depict the same thing. Remember that the Venus of Urbino, that she was a concubine. She was a concubine of the Duke of Urbino. This is a prostitute, so same sort of situation. But what made this one okay was it was traditional, this reference to Venus, which, permitted the nudity. And this one is defying any sort of tradition or mythological convention. But I will tell you something. Time is a beautiful thing. Outrage turns to acceptance, which eventually turns to celebration. My personal thought is this is one of the most important paintings of all time, Manet's Olympia. That angular and flattening treatment of the form is a very, very tentative step towards the abstraction, the geometric abstraction of human form. This sort of idea of geometric abstraction, which again, super early, like this is not abstract, but it's starting to be in the sense that she's so angular and rigid. Those things are going to be picked up by the post-impressionists and then eventually in very meaningful ways by the cubists. And this is what makes Manet's work avant-garde, a term that means experimental, cutting edge, innovative, exceedingly contemporary for the time. And this is probably why Manet's work made people so uncomfortable. People are uncomfortable with change. They like things to be as they always have known them to be. They are familiar. Something like this. This is familiar. This, people did not know what to do with. Now let's take another look at some images of public leisure. We've got two paintings here, one by Edgar Degas, and here's another one by Edouard Manet. They are different, yet they are similar. In Degas' image, we see a woman who's been drinking the absinthe in front of her. She appears sad with her blank expression, staring off into space. Her shoulders are slumped and her hat seems to be sliding forward. Absinthe was a very popular alcoholic drink in 19th century France, but it was very dangerous. It was addictive and it could cause psychosis or even death. So dangerous, but it was so popular, especially among the working class. Perhaps people drank absinthe because it was a vehicle for escaping, trying to mitigate the alienation of this modernized urban Paris. Absinthe was so popular, actually, but yet so dangerous, that it actually constituted a borderline public health crisis in the late 19th century in France. This painting could certainly be a comment on this problem. This lady doesn't look like she's doing too well. And it also could be a reflection of social anxieties that existed regarding this idea of women consuming alcohol, which was not considered to be ladylike. And I'm wondering if that's what is indeed what Degas is intending to say as she sits in this kind of like unladylike position with legs partially open. Now in the plum, we have a similar situation. We have this woman who's slumped over, seemingly defeated with this far-off look. Now this woman has been identified as a prostitute because she's alone. She's not accompanied by a man, which a proper woman would have been. And she's also smoking, as you can see right here, also considered unladylike. From a formal standpoint, in these two paintings, there's a lot of interesting commonalities. Basically, the one I see the most is that line is being used to suggest this sense of imprisonment. In the Degas painting, the diagonals of the table, which we can see here, are appearing to literally be imprisoning these figures, reinforcing their isolation, trapping them in. referring to this idea of the alienation that for many was part of the modern urban experience. All these people that live together in close proximity, but so many people that nobody knows each other, and that feels very lonely. The positioning of the foreground table that we see right here in the corner, this suggests that we too are sharing the same experience. We're sitting behind our own table, trapped perhaps. And then the woman in the Manet painting, she's also trapped as well behind her table. Now again, we want to consider the implication of our presence as the viewer. In both cases, we are very close to these figures. Like in the Caillebotte painting, we are not being acknowledged. We are being shut out, and this is making me feel so sad. Even when there is more than one person in the painting, like we can see here with the absinthe drinkers, there's still no interaction. Nobody interacts with each other. Everybody is a stranger. Now you don't have to take notes. Can we just take a minute to look at a lovely painting of an asparagus? Ah, the beauty and the soft forms of this vegetable, the soft roundness of the shapes, the different colors of heavy brushstroke that create the form. This little piece of blue, that's my favorite spot in the whole painting. My second favorite is these little bits of red right in here. The way it rests on the table in a slight angle. I think the takeaway here is that we see asparagus in a whole new way. Even if you don't like asparagus, you may have a whole new appreciation for it. Manet is such an incredible painter. He makes me love asparagus. Now, the Impressionists didn't just paint scenes of modern urban life, with modern figures engaged in various forms of entertainment. They also painted landscapes, such as the one that we see here painted by Monet, not to be confused with Manet, two different people. Now again, Impressionism is concerned with capturing a single moment in time, to suggest that it's just a temporary moment in time. Impressionist works will take on this sketchy quality that's achieved through these loose brush strokes, to suggest speed and spontaneity that the artist needs to capture this moment in time before it passes. And in this particular image, the artist is really looking at the changeability of the landscape. That nature is not static, it's not fixed, that it changes over time. And it makes me wonder, could this be a metaphor for the constantly changing nature of modern life? And we can see the reference to modern life here. If you look in the background, you've got all these smokestacks that are beginning to populate the landscape, pumping out all the smoke that's interacting with the atmosphere to create this fiery sunrise. Now let's consider these ideas and look at some more examples of Monet paintings. What happened was in the 1890s, Monet embarked on a series of paintings. He painted a grouping of poplar trees. He painted a series of images of the Rouen Cathedral, which are included in your textbook. And he also did a series of haystacks, which is what we're looking at here. Two of the total series, he did 30 haystack paintings. And this was the first series of the 3 that he began to work on. With all of these series, the whole point was to investigate the effects of light and color. With these 2 series, he picked a single subject and he paints it repeatedly. And the similarity in the subject matter allowed for these subtle differences in the subject to become much more apparent. As you can see here, he would depict the same subject, but at different times of the day and at different times of the year, at times when lighting and atmospheric conditions are distinctly different. In typical Impressionist style, the light and the atmosphere work to dissolve the forms into these hazy suggestions of themselves. Much more so, though, than what we see in other examples. It's a way for Monet to create an increasingly abstract imagery. But I want to emphasize something here. I am saying increasingly abstract, not abstract. We're not quite there yet. Just not yet. Monet is certainly paving the way. He is planting the seed for the first true abstract work of art in the context of modern art, which will make its appearance post-Impressionism with the artist Cezanne, which is why his name is here, 2 stars on each side. What these series-based paintings are they are studies of color. and how colors are interacting with one another. When does their placement intensify colors? When does it tone colors down? These are the things Monet is thinking about. These series of paintings that Monet did are really important, and we need to note this, particularly in this context of Cézanne, this post-impressionist painter I keep talking about, that we are going to be looking at in the next lecture. He is a painter who I believe is one of the most significant painters in all of history. Of course, underneath Giotto. With this series, as I said, we have Monet really thinking about abstraction in his work, starting to think about abstraction. And this is something that Cézanne is totally going to take further in his work in really important and meaningful ways. But what we also have here, and this is really important, is we have analysis going on. The analysis of light and color. And I want to say this also is important. In Impressionist painting, the two most important formal elements, and this is not just with Monet, this is with all of them, light and color. But what Monet is doing, that we don't really see other Impressionist painters doing, is analyzing. And this is something else that Cézanne is going to pick up and really develop in super important and significant directions. Here's the takeaway. Monet gets the ball rolling for Cézanne, who will extend these ideas in meaningful ways that are going to have major, major impact on modern art. I personally think this is exciting. Now, let's talk a little bit about gender. Gender does factor into Impressionism, and you might be able to get the sense of that in this comparison that I have here on the screen. The work on the right is, it's the work on the left. The work on the left is promoting the ideal male of 1860s Paris. It's an urban figure that is known as a flaneur, which is a purposeful male stroller. He's well-mannered, impeccably dressed, which you can see. And of course, there's a class aspect here. To dress so fashionably, you certainly have to have at least some sort of financial means. And he's also not working. He just basically walks around. He is an observer, observing daily life, devoted to keeping up with current events, gossip, freely navigating public space, while making sure he is conspicuously displayed at the same time. We see the flaneur dressed so nicely in his suit. He's got his light walking coat, his hat. And you actually, if you see in the very corner here, we have another flaneur as well. We see here, though, this one, our male figure in mid-stride, caught in the act of strolling about, purposefully with his arms behind his back. With the concept of the flaneur, we see the promotion of a man who is free as an action in his actions. He can roam about, he can observe others, and this is different from acceptable female behavior of the time, which did not permit this. For upper-class women, there was a risk of ruining their reputation. If they went out alone, they only could go out with a male chaperone. Also, the obligations of their domestic responsibilities often prevented this type of freedom as well. American-born artist Mary Cassatt was probably the best-known female Impressionist artist, and her subject matter demonstrates the gender divide in Impressionist art as well. We've seen Impressionist works depicting public spaces of leisure. Primarily, these are painted by men because they're out and about, they're witnessing this. Cassatt, on the other hand, she's focusing on subject matter that is associated with the private realm. Lots of portraits and domestic scenes. She's especially well known for her depictions of mothers and children. With the work here on the right, we have the promotion of more traditional female gender roles, those which were prescribed by mid to late 19th century French culture, where here we see the affairs of women in the domestic realm. Now with Cassatt's work, we have a depiction of the tea ritual, which is clearly indicated by this disproportionately large tea set, where this tea set is such a strong area of compositional interest, really like taking my attention. It might even be arguably the focal point. Now, similar to the flaneur, we see the type of dress and manners that were expected for the upper class women. They are elegantly dressed, carefully posed and postured. Their appearance is refined, they are demure, they are quiet, and we get this through the stillness of the composition. And also there's kind of like their smallness, how they're dwarfed by the space, they're dwarfed by the tea set. We also get a sense of the woman's softness through the soft feminine color palette. But also like Caillebott's painting, there is a sense of pensive psychology here. And it's again one that doesn't involve the viewer. They don't interact with each other, nor do they interact with us. And again, despite the close proximity between them and us, no interaction, and the effect is isolating. Now, prior to 1853, Japan had been pretty much isolated from the rest of the world, except for limited contact with China, Korea, the Netherlands, and Portugal. In 1853, U.S. Naval Officer Matthew Perry sailed the ships onto the shores of Japan, negotiates a trade treaty, and this ends Japan's isolation. As a result, tons of Japanese cultural artifacts are flowing into the United States and especially Europe. And this changed Western art from here on out. In France, it sparked a craze in which people were dying to get their hands on anything Japanese. It was incredibly fashionable. This craze is known as Japonisme. Now, interestingly, there was a particular demand for Japanese ceramics, and these fragile pieces were shipped in wrapped paper that had on them, on the paper, these woodblock prints. These prints date to the Edo period of Japanese art, and there are some social and economic coincidences, and you know I'm doing that quote mark thing with my hands right now, because no such thing as coincidences. Social and economic coincidences are occurring between the Edo period and what was going on in France that really, in my mind, are nothing short of uncanny. In the Edo period in Japan, we see the rise of the merchant class. They're getting all this extra money, and what are they doing with it? Spending it on leisurely activities. Why does this sound so familiar to me? The Japanese are spending their money on kabuki theater, prostitutes, courtesans, geisha, which by the way, not prostitutes traditionally, and they're traveling out to rural areas on holiday. And these woodblock prints are capturing the experiences. I don't know, kind of like how Impressionist painting is capturing the leisurely experiences of the everyday French. These Japanese woodblock prints from the Edo period are referred to as yoeko-e, which translates to floating world pictures. It's a commentary on the temporary nature of life and the fleeting nature of pleasure, which is something so beautiful, I think. The sort of tragic, melancholy beautiful. With the abundance of all of these yoke-e woodblock prints, and there's a general cultural predilection for all things Japanese, it's really no surprise that these prints were an influence on French painting. If we look at these two Degas paintings, compare it to this print by Tori Kiyonaga, we can see that there's a lot of similarities. First, we've got interior scenes, but these interior scenes have a cropping of space, right? Where the space extends out beyond the confines of the picture frame. And we can see this here and here as well. This was something that really was not seen regularly in painting until we had the exposure of the Japanese print, except for in one instance. And I bet you can remember, I hope you can remember. Remember this guy named Giotto? He was cropping space. The vanguard ahead of his time. And then this idea gets lost. It comes reinvented with the influence of the Japanese woodblock print. We also have the use of sharp diagonals, which we see here, here, and a little bit right in here. Similar subject matter, women bathing. And these women are caught in these unique unconventional poses, which is again rare. They're kind of weird, they're kind of awkward, right? This lady in like mid-step into the tub, looking at this lady like down from above, this lady in the process of getting down, this lady from the back. Again, very, very rare in art prior to the exposure to Japanese prints, except for, again, with Giotto. Now, We also have the depiction of voyeurism, right? This looking in on people who are not aware that that's occurring. And that's happening with this creeper guy right in here. And that's something that, again, we know gets picked up in Impressionist painting. We saw it with the Caillebotte painting at the beginning of this lecture. Now, it is known that Degas owned a copy of this print, and it hung in his bedroom. And I think that that really does clearly substantiate this particular print's influence on these bathing images that were made by Degas. Here's another work by Degas. This time a sculpture. Sculpture is part of the Impressionist style, even though most people tend to be more familiar simply with the painting. This is a subject the artists work with quite frequently, the ballerina. She's another figure who represents modern leisure because she's an entertainer. Now, at this time in France, sculptors were responding to the developments that were being made by Impressionism, with Impressionism's rejection of descriptive realism, primarily as the influence. Sculptors also began to feel empowered to do the same, to allow their work to become expressionistic rather than overly naturalistic, which is what we're seeing in Degas' work here. There is a raw, unfinished quality to this piece, where we can see the artist's handling of the material. You see the way his fingers were onto this soft material, wax, because it's the lost wax process, the softness of the wax, and then he casts in bronze. He doesn't smooth it away to make the skin feel smooth. So think of this idea of the hand of the artist made visible because it's not smoothed away. Just like the hand of the artist is visible in the painting because the brushwork isn't smoothed away. Like Manet's early work, Luncheon on the Grass, Olympia, this was something that took some convincing on the part of the public. When this sculpture was exhibited, people were shocked at how rough and unfinished it looked. They were also shocked that it was so straightforward and truthful, that it wasn't idealized, which we know has been a huge sculptural tradition that dates all the way back to the classical period. But here's what's really groundbreaking about this sculpture. Degas used actual fabric to suggest the costume of the dancer. This is actual fabric and the ribbon of the hair. Instead of casting this, he goes out and he finds his fabric, incorporates it into the subject. This is a highly innovative choice, never seen in sculpture before. It does a lot for the work, I think. It gives it a sense of lightness, a sense of playfulness. And it has this really nice tension, this lightness of the fabric, set against the solidity of this sculptural material, which is bronze. The softness also does much to contrast the sharp angles of the piece, where you have the stance of the figure, which is called stage rest, this proud, erect posture, creating these diagonal lines, which in this case intimate the movement that she's about to engage in. Now, for me, I just want to say, this really is important, this idea of using an untraditional material, this idea of a found fabric. This is going to become the forefront of sculptural experimentation as we move on and looking at modern sculpture. And you know what's going to happen. When we get there and we're looking at these sculptures that are using these found materials that never have been used in sculpture before, I'm going to say, I feel like we've seen this before. And you will know that we have. And we saw it in Impressionist sculpture with what Degas is doing here. Now we'll finish up by looking at an American painting, the turn of the century. And John Singer Sargent is considered to be realist, an American realist painter. And this is a designation that, quite frankly, keeps me up at night. I find that the brushwork is much too loose to really be considered a realist. Although here I admit it is pretty tight, but that tight brushwork, this is unusual for Sargent. I chose this painting, even though it doesn't have that loose brushstroke, as a treat. So beautiful and lovely to look at, as all Sargent paintings are, really. And in fact, the first thing I do whenever I go to any museum is to check and see if there's a Sargent in the collection, and then I immediately go straight and look at that painting first. And I think you should all do that too. I hope that everyone gets a chance in their life to see a beautiful Sargent painting in person. But you know what I really love about Sargent? That his work reminds me of Manet and Caillebotte, particularly in this idea of using black in such a beautiful and luscious and luxurious way. So gorgeous, So rich and so velvety. So Sargent was well known particularly for his portraits of wealthy people. This is one of his portraits, and this is of a young Parisienne, whose name we see right here. She was famous for no reason, just went around being stylish and fashionable, kind of like the Kim Kardashian of 19th century France, but probably not as obnoxious. And it's said that when Sargent met her, he became so obsessed by her beauty that he wanted to paint her. And he did it for free. Didn't even get a commission. This was just, I want to paint you. And he did it as an homage to her beauty. And we totally see that here, I think. This dramatic yet elegant and refined profile. The richness of her dress, that amazing black, which is set off so nicely against the whiteness of her skin. And the plain background that's executed in these neutral tones that really highlight this black and white contrast, to really ensure that our attention remains on the beauty of the subject and her fashionable dress. Now, unfortunately, when Sargent exhibited this at the Paris Salon, didn't go over well. The original painting actually had this strap on her dress falling off on her shoulder. People were so scandalized by this, they thought it was so inappropriate, that after the exhibit, Sargent had to take the painting back and he had to fix the strap of the dress so it's up, like we see here. People were so scandalized he had changed the name to Portrait of Madame X to protect her reputation, and then he actually had to go into exile in England. So people were a lot more sensitive about things those days than they are now.